we're good to go? Yeah. Private equity does not see lives, they see dollars for investors. 3 parts of our model. First, on the alternative sources of funding that we will support. We're happy to fund a well-funded government fund that will A, give preferential low-interest loans to startups, and B, allocate them on the basis of public need. Why is the government likely to do so? Well, firstly, we point to the overwhelming public interest that exists to ensure that this will be well-funded because healthcare is a top priority for the vast majority of voters. And secondly, we would analogize this to the way in which the government allocates money on the basis of social need all the time in lieu of research grants. The last thing to say is that even if this, the last thing to say is that there are always other sources of funding available, like the research grants that I've already illustrated, which means that all we are doing is removing one particular source of funding that is particularly pernicious and leads to terrible, terrible healthcare. Secondly, after this startup phase, we're happy for these companies to then be publicly listed on the stock market. The last thing I want to say is that this debate exists on 2 frontiers. One frontier is with respect to healthcare facilities like aged care and hospitals, and the other frontier is with respect to healthcare products like pharmaceutical products. We think that both frontiers are fair game in this debate, and I'll start with the one on healthcare facilities. Before that, I'll take a point.
So given that government doing some funding of healthcare companies is the status quo, and you're getting rid of a source of funding, do you concede that there is less healthcare funding on your side?
No. We'll top the shortfall, right? That's what the government funding will do. It's be additive to that. Yeah.
We have counterfeit, so we could also do that. It's extremely unclear how that's mutually exclusive.
No. Like we'll add the money, right? Like just not. Clarification. So, on respect to healthcare facilities, the first thing to say is when do facilities become privatized? It's either because local governments have chosen to privatize them on the basis of various concerns, or because they were previously run by religious organizations. The crucial thing to say is that at the point at which these companies need money, the way in which they were able to gain that money historically was via a state bailout. The reason why that bailout does not happen anymore, and that suggests the gap that this team doesn't really seem to mention in their POI, is twofold. Firstly, because the point at which private equity steps into the market, that reduces the impetus for the state to feel like they need to invest in healthcare instead, which suggests that there's a crowding out effect that occurs there. But secondly, because the private sector engaged in extensive lobbying to ensure that state bailouts didn't occur, which is why the current imperative of a paucity of state funding and the fact that private equity has filled a void has been established in this debate. Why is that incredibly harmful that we have allowed private equity to fill that void? Firstly, because private equity engages in cutting costs. It looks like things like cutting this quality of care, having terrible staff ratios, cutting corners when things like facilities. But secondly, and this is crucial, the way in which they operate things like hospitals and aged care is by encouraging doctors and health professionals to do things that are not in the medical interest of the people that they are serving, but in the interest of profit. It looks like, for example, pushing for surgeries that did not have, at best, a dubious medical benefit, but potentially a real risk of harm, but necessarily because it meant that they would visit the hospital more and therefore they would earn the money. Thirdly, it looks like chronically underpaying and exploiting these workers, which has led to a very real skill deficit in these industries at large, which is why there's a huge problem of nursing shortages, huge problems of aged care worker shortages. It's because the standards that set by these private equity companies are so low that they drag down the rest of the industry in a way that means that we have led to an enormous skill gap there. Now, why have private equity companies been able to do all of this virtually unaccountably? It's because that they exist in an economy and a particular industry that has a natural tendency towards a natural monopoly. Why is that the case? It's because when you're talking about things like retirement homes and hospitals, they cover consumer bases so large that it's very, very difficult for a meaningful competitor to set up shop in that area without being, destroyed from the outset. And secondly, because any potential competitor would have to incur such enormous, huge upfront costs of building the hospital, like purchasing the land for that hospital to be built, hiring the requisite specialized and highly technical staff in order to run that hospital, which is why this is an industry that is a natural monopoly, which suggests that any arguments about regulating against it or encouraging the competition of that doesn't work from side negative, because those factors are inherent to the nature of the healthcare industry, which is why it's not conducive to a private market. Now, why is this not true of the alternative that we point to? The first thing to say is that the problem with private equity is that it can allow these hospitals to fail because they are managing funds with a variety of other assets. So even if this asset dies, they have other assets to rely upon. But publicly listed companies for whom the hospital is their main business model can't allow their business model to die. So in that case, their profit incentive to maintain the company is aligned with the social goal of making sure there is a hospital to cure these people. But secondly, again, that explains why that's not uncomparative. So what are the impacts of this? Firstly, in the worst cases for side negative, hospitals close down all the time. I'm going to give you reasons to explain why private equity also encourages particularly risky business models, but I would note that that risk is built in the cake to the extent that private equity just fundamentally has a lesser stake in this particular investment to begin with. But secondly, because they engage in the various predatory behaviors that I've outlined previously. That explains why on the frontier of healthcare facilities, side affirmative is already substantially ahead. Secondly, on healthcare products, the way this is worse is twofold. First, we're going to explain that this encourages healthcare companies to pursue far riskier business models. And secondly, we'll explain how it makes, in a way that's harmful and probably causes and secondly, we'll explain how this results in delivery with respect to cost and quality of care, but also far worse for consumers, which we should probably care about as well. So, why does it lead to far riskier and bad business models? The first thing to say is that what private equity wants for these companies to pursue are exponential returns rather than linear returns. And what that means is that it pressures companies to pursue things that would have the greatest potential for mass market ventures, rather than something that is relatively less sexy but therefore more certain. It looks like things like, for example, pursuing things like the cure to baldness, rather than various elements which could far reliably say things that don't needs, but aren't necessarily more speculative because private equity firms are necessarily looking for pie-in-the-sky innovations. But secondly, and this is crucial, they often impose stringent deadlines in a way that curbs the quality of any innovation. Now, I'm sure first negative might be like, well, they wouldn't do that, they want a return. But here's the thing, what private equity wants is they want to maximize returns themselves, but not just returns, but to maximize consistent returns. That is to say that during periods of economic downturn, where all their other assets are flailing, what they need is to make sure that this particular asset is able to scrunch up the numbers and to balance their balance sheets. That is quite important because it means that they force enormous deadlines to make sure to rush those innovations to the market, which at the very least probably compromises the quality of that product. But in the cases where that doesn't work and there isn't an end product, that means that these companies burn cash and essentially nothing by chasing dreams that will never manifest. Secondly, with respect to delivery of drugs, the problem with private equity firms is that they encourage them to develop products that have higher prices and higher utilization rather than the social good. That looks like, for example, causing healthcare companies to prioritize developing vaccines, which need to be periodically treated and therefore provides a consistent stream of revenue, rather than a treatment one and done that could cure that disease for all. Contrast that to the set of publicly listed companies we are talking about, which is to say that the founders of those publicly listed companies have a real preference to prioritize healthcare and profit not so much, for the reason that they chose to start a healthcare company rather than any other type of business model, which suggests that these are people who would do things for the social good. These are companies that cut costs for the profit without considering the lives of people, and for those reasons we are very proud to address.
Ellie, can you check me my phone?
Woo!
Let's go.
So the reason that entire speech doesn't work right is because their comparative is private equity investment is worse than public investment? Perhaps, but every dollar you increase the fund by, we can increase the fund by using our counter fiat. And you're like, well then we'll make up the shortfall again. We use more political capital. So we'll use that money as well. That is absolutely not the comparative. And that's a huge problem for this first affirmative, because every argument that they make uses the comparative of public versus private, which is not the comparative in this debate. Let's start with a little bit of setup. So, first of all, on their fiat, so we are obviously also going to commensurately fund like the healthcare system to whatever degree they do as well. That is clearly not the part of this debate. That is not symmetric. And secondly, I note that actually we think private equity investment is probably net capital attractive from public investment. That is for three reasons. First, where you have private equity investment, they have an incentive to lobby for the government to invest more because that makes their investments more profitable, and private equity guys and people who work in government is a pretty big revolving door. Secondly, once private equity shows that things can work, the government knows where to direct that investment so they can get more return. And third, often healthcare investment has a very large activation energy. You have to have quite a bit of it before you can get any benefit, which means the government often doesn't have enough money to be able to do so. But once private equity brings us most of the way there is benefit that can be gained from a smaller level. So in fact, we probably get more money, but even so, they definitely don't get more money than us. And the other thing to note is, actually, insofar as we're using the counter fiat that we have, they burned some of the fiat that they used to do this really fucking unpopular policy. So we even get some more money, right? Because the healthcare companies aren't going to like this, the private equity companies aren't going to like this, and people are going to be pretty mad when they see the ads being like, the government stopped us from investing in your stuff. So, the other thing I want to note here is that in the vast majority of jurisdictions, and we're happy to use a little bit of our counter fiat here if we need to, although I'll note that we don't really need to, these exist under the status quo anyway, there's an enormous amount of regulation for healthcare companies. First of all, this looks like rigorous enforcement of antitrust laws with often higher bars for healthcare companies. Secondly, where these are directly consumer facing, we have regulations around what they can do, around not misleading patients, around minimum care requirements and reporting, around not turning people away. We can do things like revoke the licenses of companies to operate. We have regulations around who is able to be a nurse and a doctor, and if they don't follow those regulations, they lose their medical licenses. Three arguments in this speech. First, why we get a lot more money into healthcare through private equity. Secondly, why private equity is a good owner. Actually, we'll just run those two. Let's start with why there is a lot of money in private equity. First, as share markets have become more efficient and it's become more difficult for us to find any differentiation where the market has under or overvalued, a lot of the money has flowed into private equity because that's where you can get a larger return. Secondly, it allows you greater agency over your investments. So firms who have the most talent can leverage that talent more greatly, where they have more control over those investments because they're invested in private companies where they own a larger share. Third, as assets under management have grown in the equity sector in general, they've turned towards private equity away from listed equities for the reason that they have concerns around capacity constraints for the number of listed equities, and because they have problems of concentration risk, because equities as a class of assets are highly correlated with each other. But fourth, I point out that the size of investments, things that the ordinary intelligent voter would know, should point you to the size of private equity firms. Things like the fact that they were able to buy out the Hilton hotel chain should suggest to you that there's an enormous amount of money available through private equity. Why do healthcare companies particularly need private equity above other sources of funding? First, healthcare companies are often super speculative. We're talking about doing things like research, which may or may not pay off, so they need investors with a high risk appetite. And secondly, it's often very startup driven at a stage where you aren't able to get comparative access. I also note that they often, particularly at the startup stage, don't have enough cash flows to do internally. They need external capital cash flows. And I'll also note that debt is very hard to acquire. First, it comes with a large degree of risk. People owning these, who are often like smaller investors, don't want to take on that degree of risk. And also, if you're run by someone who's not private equity, access to debt is much harder because the people writing the debt trust the private equity owners more than they trust you. The final thing I'd note is that going public at this stage is incredibly hard. First, you are super small scale, it's very hard to do so. Secondly, you're often just not technically able to do so. Like there's a lot of, the process of getting listed is very technically complex, you probably don't have enough expertise. Third, because it's super speculative and something that we're not sure how much value it has, it's not particularly right for an IPO. Fourth, there's a lot of requirements, things like management practices and bookkeeping that you have to have that are hard for smaller businesses, which is why very often you end up going from being privately owned to being owned by private equity and then into being publicly listed rather than straight to being publicly listed. And finally, these companies are often struggling. That's the reason they get bought out by private equity, so they're unlikely to get publicly listed. The impact of this is that these guys constrain an enormous amount of capital. They constrain capital that the healthcare industry badly needs from being able to invest in this. The first impact of this is that companies cannot exist at all. Many many companies will simply go down. Secondly, we are able to have more capital, which means more investment, which means that we get better outcomes for healthcare companies. Second argument, why is private equity actually a particularly good investor? First, yeah.
Do you think that a profit-driven foreign investor is superior to a local former public administrator for a local hospital system?
Yeah, because the public administrator doesn't have nearly their expertise. The profit motive is the thing that's delivered the modern healthcare industry. The profit motive is the reason why people don't die of diseases that 100 years ago were certain death. I will absolutely stand behind the profit motive. Why are private equity good investors? First, a lot of incredibly smart people, they pay incredibly large salaries. Second, they have experience specifically in what a lot of these companies need to do. That's to say, scaling up. Third, they have to know the businessy part of it, that the people who owned it previously, who might be healthcare providers by nature, which, as Beach says, is often the comparative. It's a healthcare administrator with fuck all actual business experience. They know the part of that, so they are much better owners. So that looks like cutting inefficiencies out of the business, being able to get greater capital investment for things that bring economies of scale, like being able to invest in something that can do pathology locally rather than having to send it out at an increased cost and to pay that markup. That means that private equity runs it more efficiently, so we're able to get more actual services to patients. We're able to get more good research. I'd also note that it's run far better by private equity than it is run by public companies, which is part of their comparative. First, you have a more dedicated activist owner who owns a larger portion of you, so they're more involved in making you better because the ownership is less diffuse. Secondly, you can then smooth through changes in prices. I note that this is very speculative, and it's far easier for private equity to take a long-term view rather than when you have to have a quarterly report and you have to be worried about your level of profit. And third, a lot of the decision-making things that come into a lot of the regulations that are required to be publicly listed make it far harder to make the kind of dynamic decisions that are needed at the stage of a healthcare startup. That means we get far better running on our side. The final thing I'll note is that the comparative in this case is often being bought out by other healthcare companies. Because if you can't go public and you can't be bought by private equity, then if you need to be bought out, you often have to be bought out by other healthcare companies. The reason it tends to be other healthcare companies and not other companies in general is first, people do mergers in their own industry because they know how to run it. And secondly, there's that benefit that when you buy them out, not only do you get access to them, but you also, not only do you buy them, but you also reduce your own competition. So it's typically other healthcare providers buying them out. So that leads to far more concentration, which is the problem that they identify. Because if private equity can't do it, it's probably another large company that you used to be competing with. What do they say? They say publicly listed is better for the reason that the investors are more interested in you if you're publicly listed because that's their entire business model, and if it goes down, this is directly flippable by their own logic, right? Because their logic is, well, the more you're reliant on this, the less risk you're willing to take. But obviously, publicly listed investors are far more diversified. They own way more equities than private equity investors who invest in a smaller number of companies, so their own mechanism shoots them in the foot. They say, well, it's bad because they'll be riskier. Yeah, but all the things that change the world, that save millions of people's lives, are riskier. They say they'll impose deadlines in private equity. No, in private equity you have a long-term time frame. It's being publicly listed where you have to be worried about the quarterly report. That is why you have irrational short-term incentives. The final thing I know is insofar as they say it used to be owned by someone like a good public healthcare administrator, probably unlikely that they sell a really terrible private equity firm. They're probably likely to be discerning about that, particularly given the untrue but incredibly powerful narratives in the media about, oh, the boogeyman of private equity because we hate capitalism.
This team's model is that maybe if we turbo fuck the entire healthcare industry large enough, maybe then governments will have enough incentives to step in and fix it. I think instead of doing that, we should just do some sensible regulations. 3 questions in the speech. How much capital is there? Where does that capital go? And is it used well in the places that it goes to? Firstly, how much capital is there? I want to note that this team only has fiat to do the motion, that is, banning private equity from investing in healthcare companies. What they don't have fiat to do is explain how much funding there would be or use their modelling power to describe the ways in which they would use that funding. How then do they attempt to prove that there would be large government funding? They say governments have political incentives to make up the shortfall where you lose out private equity funding. The first observation to make about this, and the first response, is to point out that this is only true for the sets of private healthcare companies for which people take active notice of their absence. There are 2 instances in which I think this is untrue, and therefore investment wouldn't occur. The first big instance is where you have private companies that specialize heavily in things like research and development of medical technology or on new medications. Because people would obviously notice if these companies went missing overnight, but where you have substantially less investment in research and development of new products that previously didn't exist, people don't notice that absence. It's different to their hospital not functioning, because what it looks like is stagnation in the medical field, which isn't something people realize, because they don't know they need something that doesn't exist yet. So that set of funding, when private equity ceases to invest in it, doesn't get a huge amount of political capital invested into restoring it. And that is the clearest proof of this is to look at where most of this innovation comes from right now, because the overwhelming majority of medical innovation comes out of the United States, the context in which most of this private equity funding exists. And that's because other governments around the world just do not have sufficient incentive to, on the scale necessary, invest in R&D. And they point out that sometimes universities get research grants. I would make two observations. Number one, not nearly on the same scale as private companies. And secondly, many of those research grants come from private companies and private equity firms who are investing in university students to do research and development on their behalf. And this matters because we're talking about the development of life-saving drugs that could be saving millions of people that we don't even know exist yet. We're talking about medical scanners that could improve our ability to catch cancer earlier on. And these are good even if they're suboptimal. So even if they say, well, they do things like patent shopping and putting patents on them, I would rather have a patented cancer-saving drug than not have that cancer-saving drug at all in the first instance, which is probably what they get on their side. The second instance where this is important then is in startups. And they observe the reason why governments wouldn't invest in startups from their side, because they say governments have substantially less capacity to invest in risk. And that is obviously true, because it looks terrible for you as a politician if you invest in a startup and that startup goes nowhere and it goes bankrupt in a few years, which is why they only invest in the existing firms, and you never get that competition. And once again, people don't know what they need when it doesn't exist yet. And that is also true of these smaller firms and all these startups, which are important for doing things like, firstly, the innovation that I previously described, and secondly, for creating competition in those industries which produces the quality that they describe. Moving on from those instances, I think there are a number of other issues with relying on government to do this funding. Firstly, lots of governments just don't have the capacity to do this funding. Many governments are already in huge amounts of debt and have lots of other forms of social spending to do. And they at least have some private investment. And they probably need as much of both as they possibly can get access to. So this team removes one option without explaining why a huge number of countries in the world ever get access to any alternative form of funding. The next problem with this, though, is that governments often empirically do fund healthcare really poorly all around the world. Like the NHS is historically terribly funded and has continuously defunded, despite the fact that there is political outcry about it, because there just isn't a huge amount of apathy. And the reason for this is healthcare is actually often pretty low on people's priority lists, because most people are healthy. They don't spend that much time in hospitals, and it's shit when you go there that one time you spend 6 hours in the ER, but you're kind of willing to cop that because you don't want your taxes to go up, and you don't want the government to stop doing other forms of social spending, which you also value for your life and you also find significant. The final thing to observe, though, is to point out this money has to come from somewhere, and it probably comes from somewhere pretty important, because the set of people that they require to do this investment are probably left-wing parties expending social capital on providing social services. So the money that they're now investing in healthcare comes out of things like welfare for poor people who need that money in order to survive, and they destroy it. Comparatively, the private equity funding that they're freeing up from being invested in healthcare probably just goes into some other stupid shit where they can make profit, and also is less profitable in doing so, because obviously they've selected the most profitable option for them. And the impacts of this are massive, and no, you can't weigh off having less capital but using that capital slightly more efficiently, because capital is the prerequisite to doing anything at all, for getting that research and development, producing those products, for providing people with healthcare, for a hospital to exist there in the first instance. To get access to good healthcare, you need access to healthcare, and that's only provided when you have access to capital. I'll take the POI.
Yeah, the reason why political capital for healthcare is low right now is because of private equity lobby, which we eliminate. The more you talk about life-saving drugs, the more likely it is that voters will demand their government for it. We always fund things for the social good, whereas you only fund
why would private equity crowd out government funding? Like, private equity firms would love it if the government paid them a $3 million check to continue to do their investment. But that aside, you don't actually prove that there is public incentive to get this kind of investment. Like, absent the investment that already exists right now, where do you get people who are protesting on the street outside of town hall saying, I want the government to invest in the next vaccine, or I want the government to invest in more cancer drugs? People have other shit in their plates, and there isn't the public incentive that you describe. You can give 0 examples of context in which that exists. Next, let's talk about where this money goes. And I would note this team does no defense of government's capacity to accurately select where to put that money. And I would note this is probably the most important aspect of the debate, more so than how that money is used. For the reason that the instances where private equity is most important is, as they observe, the stage between where you are a firm and where you go public. Which means what we're talking about is startups. And when you select poorly which startup to invest in, it has huge flow-on consequences. Because if you invest in a bad and inefficient firm that then becomes the monopoly provider of that service, you then get a substantially worse service than you otherwise could have had. 3 reasons why governments are bad at allocating funding. The first is they're just not as experienced as private firms, which means, hold on one second. They're just not as experienced as private equity firms. They don't invest in the same level of analysis, and they're not as successful at doing so, and they don't have as strong an incentive because they lack that profit incentive, which means they don't invest in getting the right people for the analysis and which one is successful. And which one is profitable is actually extremely important, because if you invest in an unprofitable firm and that firm goes bankrupt, even if that firm was the most ethical firm of the ones available, it's now bankrupt, so it's not doing anything, it isn't providing anyone with healthcare. So that expertise in what's profitable is actually essential in getting anything done. Secondly though, many governments are extremely corrupt. As they observe, they're subject to huge amounts of lobbying, and they're subject to lobbying from the largest pharmaceutical firms, which means the vast majority of funding in their world is probably directed to the major set of pharmaceutical companies that exist right now, rather than private equity firms being willing to invest in startups that are potentially profitable for themselves. The third problem with this, the reason why governments are bad though, is just that governments have lots of other stupid incentives. They want to do things like cut ribbons in front of new hospitals, and maybe building a new hospital isn't the right move, maybe you should expand the existing hospital or improve the quality there. And they do that all the time in order to curry political favor, and that also explains why they never invest in startups. Finally, let's talk about whether the capital is used well. This team says, well, these firms are so pernicious, they love fucking over people, so they're going to make sure everyone's healthcare is ruined. The first point I would make about this is obviously we have some level of counterfeit, and the reason why you should believe that counterfeit can be used successfully to remove these problems is to look at the way that private equity and private hospitals exist in any context other than the United States where they are unregulated. This suggests to you that these regulations can work. You can do things like mandate the number of staff that you need per ward to ensure they don't understaff them. You can do things like have a decent minimum wage that means those staff are actually treated well, and you can make those contexts work. And I would note in many instances where private hospitals exist, they're better than public hospitals because their profit incentive allows them to be more efficient. That's why hospitals in the NHS suck and private hospitals in the UK are substantially better, because they have that capacity, because they have that freedom, because they have access to capital. But the second problem with this though is obviously many of those profit incentives are great and encourage them to do good things. They do things like cut down on administrative costs, they do things like invest in better systems, they do things like engage in better management. And none of that, even if they were able to prove it, would overcome the fact that we get more healthcare and healthcare funding that is allocated better on our side. Very proud to oppose.
Can I be heard? Well, I want to begin this speech by just thanking my teammates. It's lovely. Right. Yeah, no, I'm going to keep doing it. Yeah, right. Let's begin. Look, I suppose there are certainly contexts in which private markets breed innovation, the fierce crucible of corporation against corporation, in which the best company wins, leaving the gladiatorial arena. But, okay, like, Brendon's favourite word in his speech, unlike Toomey's, which was like capitalism, the correct favourite word in this debate is natural monopoly. And we're talking about natural monopolies. And so in that context, the set of behaviours that the opposition are talking about are distorted. There cannot be a gladiatorial arena in the domain of regional hospital management, because regional hospital management systems are inherently defined by a single administrator and a captive audience. When you talk about the pricing strategies for diabetes drugs that were developed by idealistic startup founders and then that were taken over by vultures that raised the price so that people weren't able to afford it, you saw that no longer were those systems in place. And of course, Toomey's memorization of a Micro 1 textbook should not disabuse you of your recollection of the world, ladies and gentlemen, in which every industry in which these corporations ends up in a world in which there are fewer people working in them, in which staff ratios decline and quality of service collapses. Working in a context in which the private healthcare facility that serves elderly people regularly ignores them for more than 24 hours, and yet the profit balance sheet shows that it's going up every year, I have never been prouder to oppose. The first question that I'll ask in this speech is, what does this do to the capital requirements of these firms? And the second question that I'll ask is, what does this do to the behaviour of these firms? Firstly, on the capital requirements of these firms. Let's begin with some arithmetic, okay? So, private investment organisations invest a set sum of money. Toomey correctly identifies that increasingly money has tracked to private investment as public markets yield lower returns. Private investment yields higher returns. A return is negative on a balance sheet's capital allocation, which means that established firms that are giving higher profits, the higher profits that they definitionally agree are being paid out, represent a net negative. And that is the real phenomenon that we describe when we talk about money. It is work, like their case is about funding, okay? When we talk about revenue, most of that or more of that is going out in profit. That is definitionally true because they're talking about above market rates of profit from private equity investment, and particularly true in the context where they're talking about highly savvy professional investors dealing with unsavvy public administrators who won't know that the term sheet of the PI that they've signed fucks them, right? So obviously we're talking about a context in which the need to impose a new private equity induced profit margin inherently involves the large sucking sound out of these businesses of any surplus capital that would be able to be allocated to better goods and services there. So that's really what we're talking about here. But you know what? Let's talk about government money. So firstly, the opposition's main objection seems to be to our greater patience. Because they say, well, we'll match your funding, and we say, we'll boost it. And they get annoyed because we keep beating them in the tennis match here. But we're not quite doing that, right? What we're rather asserting in this case, yeah, I'll compare like 7 minutes, and I reckon Ellie will be so mad that I'll end up like getting the last word in. So, however, the bigger thing to understand here, right, is that we believe that they would be well funded. Now, at second speaker, the opposition says, I guess the first thing they say is actually there's not a lot of public will to fund healthcare in a lot of these cases, okay? They give the example of the NHS. Look, healthcare is very expensive. The United Kingdom is not necessarily extraordinarily well managed. It is important to understand that the healthcare outcomes from privately managed healthcare facilities in the United Kingdom, which is not hospitals but is aged care, do not get statistically better results in terms of saving of life, in terms of like, I think, patient satisfaction surveys, they are worse, right? So I think that is more a problem of the fact that like the United Kingdom should have been dissolved 20 years ago, right? Generally speaking, we are talking about sets of nations that have enormous political will in healthcare. For example, if you do an opinion poll in Israel right now, issue number 2 is healthcare amongst their body politic, right? If you do an opinion poll in the United States, it is consistently one of the most important issues that people report on. And the opposition's characterization is that people don't care about it that much. But of course, significant reforms would lead to significant scrutiny that would lead to an increase in salience in the issue, that would lead to a change in the funding model. It is also worth thinking about, I'll take you in a moment there, it is also, of course, worth remembering that we're not just talking about like the body politic, we're also talking about elites, right? And anyone who is worried about the functionality of like a labour market is worried about healthcare outcomes, because healthcare outcomes are directly correlated to the ability of the labour force to continue to deliver sustainable returns and stay out of sort of like pensions and stuff like that. So of course, we're also talking about a significant amount of lobbying here. Yeah.
How would you qualitatively describe Australia's healthcare system?
I mean, like, look, better than the United States. Right, like a hell of a lot better, because like we have people stay alive for longer, and it costs us, I believe, half as much, right? And you know, like there's the system that's closer to yours. It is actually worth pointing out here that like the opposition then has this idea that well, most investment comes out of the United States. But it is worth just identifying that is because the United States is like a way bigger GDP than any other country, right? Like I think that proves a much more general observation than what they think that it actually does.
Point.
So, no. Then the next thing that the opposition talks about is basically about the amount of capital that is available in these places. But I want to note here that investment itself is not trivially a good when we're talking about firms that have been established for the profit-based reasons that I've talked about. Often private equity directly substitutes for state investment that would otherwise go ahead there. So really the only leg that they have to stand up is on the degree of startups, right? The stakeholder in which we're talking about in terms of administration of hospitals and in terms of aged care facilities are actually left untouched by all of this stuff because they don't require enormous like facilitative investment. They require, you know, sort of like periodic investments that states would be incentivized to provide. They don't need enormous amounts of capital to provide. Let's then talk about the development of medicine and medical devices, okay? When we're talking about the requirements for capital, it is worth remembering that the effect of diminishing marginal returns is extraordinarily true when you look at investment here. It is then important to remember that we still have our fund, and both teams have sort of agreed that there is going to be a certain amount of investment. So what the opposition is talking about is merely cutting off the surplus enormous amount of investment that would actually lead to the least efficient set of investments being cut off, right? Now the opposition, I think, probably intelligently points out that governments might be bad at identifying these things. The first thing to identify is that if it is true that experience in these things and being a corporation made you good at this type of investment, then McKinsey would open a branch doing it and the government would hire them, right? Like governments can 100% capture that particular form of consultative efficiency should they want to. But secondly, governments are better at this type of decision than private firms because they have access to vastly more data. Governments have access to extraordinary amounts of data that is public but held away from the ability of these firms to make decisions, and also because they have different incentives. Let us finally then briefly discuss behaviour. So we describe a set of hugely negative behaviours. The opposition says that they want to bring the hammer of private efficiency down on hospitals. We told you that those efficiency losses mostly come in terms of not changing bedpans. And the opposition talks about like efficiency and regulation a lot, but those are often the forms that you need to do to make sure that you don't fuck up in a way that harms patients. And that is often the efficiency that is talked about here. The other thing the opposition talks about is regulation, which is curious for a team that did not believe that governments were even slightly capable of making good investments. I don't know why they trust those guys. Very proud to affirm.
Firstly, win in the hard way by mounting a defense of the profit motive. I don't think it's that hard, but it's comparatively hard. And then it will take the really easy way, the low-hanging fruit, which is just to prove that there's a bunch of money in healthcare on our side of the debate that would not exist otherwise, and that money in healthcare is probably good. Let's start with the profit motive. I want to make two observations at the outset of this. The first observation I want to make is that a lot of affirmatives' qualms about the profit motive are kind of absurd, because this is a debate about healthcare companies, which themselves have profit motives. Like a lot of the horror stories just described to you by Beach are not necessarily the result of private equity companies, but rather just healthcare companies which are indeed trying to make a profit. And very little of their analysis is sufficiently specific to explain to you why private equity companies are uniquely bad, except to kind of do some bogeyman style characterization and hope for the best. So I think you should be curious about this mech from the outset. But the second observation I want to make is just to compare the quality of reasoning that both teams give you as to whether or not the profit motive and whether or not efficiency is bad. Because I think a huge amount of so-called analysis from this team is just to kind of paint private equity and make it sound scary and spooky, and to compare it to, like, you know, your sweet local vaccine farmer. We are the team that gives you actual analysis about why private companies might have pretty good business practice. They might have pretty good incentives to get into healthcare in a way which, yes, is profit generating, but indeed that profit is generated from offering a service which happens to be healthcare. Alright, the next thing I want to do here is just to explain what the impacts of the profit motive actually are in healthcare to illustrate why they are indeed very good. I think there are broadly three. Firstly, efficiency. And I think that the first thing I want to do here is just to observe that there are likely lots of inefficiencies in the healthcare industry that we could get rid of, and that it would be good to get rid of. And I think that this team underestimates the value of getting rid of efficiency. The thing you should ask yourself is, if we have a limited amount of money to spend on an industry that has enormous potential to save people's lives, should we be spending it inefficiently? And I would say probably not. I think that that is letting down people pretty severely. And I think the kind of efficiencies we're talking about are things like massive administrative efficiencies. You know, hospitals and actually like all sorts of healthcare practices often have to deal with pretty complex systems regarding things like insurance, regarding things like patient data management. Those things are often at a local scale done poorly, because that is the kind of task which at scale, with large private companies with huge amounts of experience in dealing with those things, is done very well, but is kind of hard to set up a bespoke system for, and that people are often not very good at. But I would also just note that there are obviously benefits from experience. You are able to do things like, you know, take lessons learned in managing some healthcare companies and apply them to others. I think that it is likely that you accumulate a series of good pieces of corporate knowledge. It probably is the case that an expert business manager can indeed manage business as well. And I also want to note that in many instances, the very simple benefit of these efficiencies, apart from meaning that you can spend more money on better healthcare stuff, is just that the hospitals we're talking about don't go bust. Because Bennett's response to this is very confusing to me. But like a fact about the way private equity firms often work is they take firms that are failing but have the potential to succeed and turn them around and make money off that improvement. That is obviously a huge benefit, because it means that healthcare companies that would have failed, that would have gone bust, that would have gone out of existence, probably exist on our side of the debate. Their only real response is to caricature efficiency and be like, well, this is about not changing bedpans. I don't know why you would do that first instead of doing things like make administration more efficient. And I also think that this is extremely easy to regulate. Like, if their mechanism is we make healthcare really shit and then the government will step in, we can do that too. Like, we won't change the bedpans and then the government will step in. And then they're like, but governments are bad, you said they're bad. Well, we would say that they're better at being like, well, you have to change bedpans, than they are at managing a hospital. We would say that the company which is an expert at the latter should do that. The next benefit we give you is about innovation. I think it's bizarre. Like, I've just been sitting in this debate totally baffled, because so much of their case is like, risk. Yeah, risk is good. Think about the risk you take. I'm not done. Think about the risk you take when you're developing a vaccine. Yeah, it's risky. Yeah, there's probability involved. Whoa, scary. But it's probably pretty good. And I think that we ought to reward it. It is like a good thing that people can leverage their property rights to take risks and get rewards for doing so. I think that is generally good. And their response to that is, again, just a caricature. They're like, well, no, the risk that you're taking is rushing medication through, approval processes or something. Like, why? Clearly, if I'm a pharmaceutical company and I have two risks I could take. One, across a bunch of R&D processes, sink some money in and hope that some of these R&Ds produce a profitable drug that everyone wants. Or two, maybe kill a bunch of people. I know which one I'm going to pick. Like, come on. The third benefit we give you is about scale, which is to suggest that there is a profit motive in amalgamating small, inefficient, but high potential businesses, for instance, private physicians, private ophthalmologists and shit, and turning them into companies. That is immensely good and never responded to, because it just means that you smooth out a lot of inefficiencies. Those people no longer have to individually deal with insurance companies, for instance. That is better for clients. It is better for the doctors employed in those practices. They never respond to it, but that is an enormous deal for just a huge amount of people just interacting with healthcare providers on a very small scale. All right, what are their responses to our material here? I think Beege's quite mysterious but charismatic response is just to say, well, there's a natural monopoly. Again, probably not. There's lots of nursing homes, right? They don't prove this, it's asserted. So if your reason for believing that this is really hard and the efficiencies that we get are bad because of natural monopoly is that there's a natural monopoly, you should ask yourself, did they prove there's a natural monopoly? The answer is no. But the other thing I would say is, again, this is just a claim that healthcare companies should maybe not be allowed to reach monopolies. That exists on their side of the house too, and we probably have some fiat on our side of the house to do antitrust. Finally, they're just like, regulation isn't possible because states are weak. But my observation that the Australian healthcare system is better than the United States healthcare system, or Beege's observation, I suppose, suggests that private equity isn't the problem in regulation here, because private equity funding is legal in Australia. That's not the reason why our healthcare system is better in the US, which suggests that probably it is the case that sometimes governments can indeed do regulation, and we maybe have to look to another mechanism rather than the hand-wavy one that side affirmative provides. I'll take a point now.
Yeah, if it's true that companies still face a profit incentive on our side, as you say in your intro, why can't they also be fairly efficient in the status quo? Your team never accepts the debate, never accepts the trade-off.
Yeah, sure. So it's probably the case that some are efficient. We would be happy to, as you say, pick winners and make them more efficient and give them lots of money. That is a benefit for our side of the house. And for the sets of companies that, by virtue of being smaller scale, by virtue of being local, etc., are not run as well, we think that private equity firms are more efficient than them for reasons that we've explained down the bench and are obvious. All right. Is there enough funding in the comparative? Because I think this is the way that we win the debate a second time. And yeah, let's get into it. The vast majority of affirmatives material requires you to believe that there are viable funding alternatives. They give two. The first is public markets. I think we respond to this handily. We explain that they firstly just do a poor job of explaining why they're better in the first instance. But secondly, they're just obviously unsuitable in many instances. Like if you're talking about a bunch of ophthalmologists, yeah, okay, trade them on a public market. But also, their response to our venture capital material makes no sense. They're like, but the government could do that grant instead and then it could go public. Why? Just have venture capital. Just let the private companies do it. Bizarre. Their other push is about governments. But I think the thing which is strange here, and the key mech for governments is, well, they get to overcome lobbying. But if they get to overcome lobbying to do their model, we can obviously overcome lobbying to do some more healthcare funding. And we give you a bunch of reasons why that is far better on our side of the house, which is that the picking winners that they describe allows governments to select where they do healthcare funding better. It is unclear to me that private equity companies chasing profits by doing things like funding baldness drugs is a harm. It means some people grow some hair back and the government can focus on funding drugs, which is good. What is the harm there? That escapes me. But I also just think it is unclear that these healthcare companies, these private equity firms, only chase winners in the sense they describe. Why don't they do things like rescue hospitals? Why don't they do things like create mRNA vaccines? I think that private equity firms are an overwhelming force for good in these industries. They give healthcare money where it needs it. I'm so proud to negate.